There is a very specific moment when a manipulator decides whether or not you are a target, and almost no one notices when this moment happens. It's not when he starts praising too much. It's not when he starts asking for favors. It's not when the relationship is already deep. The real beginning happens first, long before. Most people imagine manipulators as obvious figures, cold, invasive, domineering, aggressive people. People who arrive imposing presence, forcing space, controlling everything around them. But the most dangerous manipulators rarely start out that way. They start observing, in silence. While you believe you are just getting to know someone, while you think that casual conversation means nothing, while your mind is busy trying to appear polite, friendly, pleasant, they are doing something else. They are testing. And here's the disturbing part. This test almost never involves direct words. It does not involve confrontations. It does not involve attacks. It involves something much simpler. It involves small, almost invisible intrusions. Things so subtle that your brain tends to ignore them. A slightly invasive comment, a personal question asked too soon, a gentle interruption while you speak, an unexplained delay, a limit crossed, but in such a small way that you hesitate to react. And at that moment, something important happens. They are not evaluating what you answered. They are evaluating what you tolerated. Pause for a second and think about this. Perhaps you have already experienced a situation like this without realizing it. A conversation where something seemed a little off, but you let it go. A joke that bothered you, but you smiled anyway. A comment that crossed a line, but you decided not to create a climate. Do you recognize this kind of moment? Because for most people, these little discomforts are just that. Small ones, passengers, ignorable. But for a social manipulator, these moments are given pure information. They observe something very specific. If you shrink to avoid conflict, if you laugh when something bothers you, if you explain yourself too much, if you try to quickly restore harmony, they watch if you try to be understanding, even when something inside you realizes there has been too much. And then the real test happens. It's not about the question they asked. It's not about the interruption. It's about whether you've protected your own boundary, or whether you've softened it so it doesn't seem difficult. This is the first silent test, and it happens so early that we are often still trying to understand who that person is. Meanwhile, she is already trying to understand something about you, something much more important. How far do you give in? How much do you adapt, as far as you tolerate? Because social manipulators don't just look for kind people. They are looking for something more specific. People who confuse kindness with self-abandonment. People who feel discomfort, but swallow to keep the peace. People who believe that being good means not reacting. And the most unsettling thing about it all is that, from the outside, nothing seems wrong. The conversation continues. The mood remains light. Maybe there is even sympathy, but somewhere unseen within that interaction, a small marker has already been recorded. And almost no one notices when this happens. You think you're just being polite. But for certain people, excessive education is strategic information. Because for those who manipulate relationships, the first question is never, is this person smart? The first question is different, much quieter. Does this person protect themselves, or do they adapt? And if you think this test is rare, or that it only happens in obvious toxic relationships. So there is something you need to understand before you continue listening. Social manipulators do not start by dominating. They start by measuring the emotional terrain. And the first test almost always happens when you still believe that nothing important is happening. The social manipulator does not enter someone's life like an invader. He comes in as a reader. Before taking any step forward, he observes invisible patterns in people's behavior. Small reactions, micro-expressions, silences, hesitations. For most people, a social interaction is just that, an exchange. But for someone who lives by exploiting human vulnerabilities, every interaction is a laboratory. And the first experiment is almost always simple. He needs to figure out what kind of emotional terrain is there. Because manipulation doesn't work the same way for everyone. Some people are difficult to manipulate. Others, not so much. And here there is a detail that tends to surprise many people. The most effective manipulators rarely seek out weak people. In fact, they often approach empathetic, responsible, generous, polite, emotionally available people. Able. People who value harmony. People who strive to understand others. People trying to keep relationships working. If you are someone like this, pay attention to what comes now. Because the first silent test doesn't try to find out if you're a good person. He tries to figure out what you do when something small bothers you. This detail changes everything. Imagine a common situation. Someone you've just met asks you a slightly invasive question. Nothing scandalous, nothing absurdly offensive, but too soon. Something about your personal life, something about your history, something that would normally only arise after a certain amount of intimacy. Your brain notices the misalignment, but almost immediately, another voice appears inside you. Maybe I'm exaggerating. Maybe the person is just curious. I don't want to seem closed off. So you respond. Maybe a little uncomfortable, maybe laughing, maybe trying to soften it. Now comes the question that almost no one asks. But it completely changes the way you see these situations. What happened inside you in that second when you decided to ignore the discomfort? Think about it calmly, not in the answer you gave, but in the silent decision that happened before her. Because it is exactly this moment that a manipulator observes. He's not just interested in the information you shared. He is interested in something deeper. He wants to know if, faced with a small social imbalance, you correct or accommodate. Because people who correct boundaries early tend to be difficult to manipulate. They adjust the interaction. They signal. They show that they are present. But people who accommodate minor discomforts send a completely different signal. They show something very specific, who prefer to preserve the harmony of the environment, even if it costs a piece of their own limit. And here's an uncomfortable truth. This pattern is extremely common among good people, educated people, empathetic people, people who were taught from an early age not to create conflict. Maybe you are part of this group. Many of us do. Here in this space, many people listening to this right now recognize exactly this type of behavior. Not because he's weak, but because he was conditioned to be understanding. Doubt comes quickly. Is it worth reacting? Am I reading this wrong? Am I being too sensitive? As these questions run through your mind, the handler watches. It measures your tolerance to discomfort. It measures your need for approval. It measures your tendency to smooth over situations. And then he begins to form a silent hypothesis about you. A hypothesis that is rarely said out loud, but it defines everything that can happen later. Because if you pass this first test, the interaction continues normally. But if you fail this test, something changes. Nothing visible, no dramatic scenes, no conflict. But inside the mind of those who manipulate human relationships, a small conclusion begins to form. A dangerous conclusion. Maybe, just maybe, you are someone worth exploring. And the most unsettling part of all this is that, for those being tested, life continues as normal. The conversation remains light. The meeting remains pleasant. Maybe there's even genuine sympathy there. But behind the invisible scenes of that interaction, something has already begun. A silent read, an analysis, an emotional mapping. Because manipulators don't need to run. They know that human relationships are like doors. And when someone shows that they tend to open small doors, to avoid discomfort, they just wait, observe, and test again. But the next test is rarely the same as the first. It tends to be even more subtle, and much more revealing. Now comes the part that tends to make a lot of people uneasy. Because when we start to look closely at these silent tests, we realize that they don't happen in dramatic situations. They happen in the most common things. Normal conversations, first dates, work environments, friendships that are beginning, Nothing seems threatening, and that's exactly why they work so well. Social manipulators understand something very simple about human behavior. Big invasions are scary. Small intrusions go unnoticed. So the first test is rarely big. It is minimal, almost imperceptible. It could be something like interrupting you in the middle of a sentence, but with a smile. It could be ignoring a detail you just said and changing the subject to something that interests him more. It could be a light joke about something personal to you. Too soon. Nothing scandalous. Nothing that makes the entire room go silent. But something inside you notices. There is a small misalignment, a micro discomfort. And that's when the test really happens. Because the manipulator is not just watching what you say. He watches how you react to your own discomfort. Do you realize this? Most people think manipulation starts with direct control, with pressure, with insistent requests. But before all this, there is a previous phase, a silent phase, a reading phase, and this reading happens in tiny moments. Let's imagine a common situation. You are telling a story, something simple, something everyday. In the middle of the sentence, the person interrupts, not to ask a question about what you said, but to tell something about herself. Your brain notices the break, but you quickly do something very common. You retreat. You laugh. You let the person continue. Maybe you even say something like, "No, you can talk." And at that moment, something very important happens. Something that almost no one notices. For you, that was just education. For the handler, that was behavioral information. Because in that moment, you showed two things. First, that you noticed the invasion, but didn't react. Second, that you quickly adapted to maintain a comfortable climate. And that says a lot, much more than any verbal response. Now imagine another situation. Someone makes a slightly critical comment about something of yours, your taste, your opinion, your way of doing something. It's not a direct attack. It is said in jest, perhaps accompanied by a laugh. Your brain notices again. Something there wasn't entirely respectful, but then comes the automatic reflex that many people have learned throughout their lives. You minimize. You respond with humor. You make a joke about yourself. You neutralize the tension. Once again, the test has been answered. But here comes a revelation that usually completely changes the way we see these interactions. Experienced manipulators don't just test outer limits. They test internal limits. They want to know if you allow yourself to feel discomfort, or if you try to erase it quickly, if you sustain the feeling of something wrong, or if you run to restore harmony. This difference is enormous, because people who sustain their own discomfort tend to perceive manipulation early. They watch, they adjust, they ask, but people who have been trained to smooth everything over often ignore the first signs. And that's exactly what the manipulator wants to find out. He doesn't need to invade much. He just needs to push a little and watch what happens. Now stop for a second and ask yourself an honest question. How many times have you felt that micro discomfort in a conversation and decided to ignore it? How many times has something felt slightly out of place, but you thought, it must be all in my head? This moment is crucial, because social manipulators know something that psychologists have studied for decades. Most people first doubt their own perception, and when someone learns to explore this doubt, the dynamics of the relationship begin to change, silently, gradually, without anyone noticing. There is a detail that makes this process even more unsettling. Often the manipulator doesn't even seem interested in dominating at that moment. He just seems curious, pleasant, observer. But behind this calm appearance there is an analysis going on. An analysis of tolerance, about limits, about reaction. And when the signs start pointing in a specific direction, a small conclusion begins to form. Not yet on how to control you, but about something earlier, something more strategic. If it's worth continuing to invest in that relationship, because for an effective social manipulator, relationships don't start with emotion. They start with vulnerability assessment, and when someone repeatedly demonstrates that they prefer to adapt their limits to maintain a comfortable environment, this fact does not go unnoticed. In fact, it tends to be exactly the type of signal that opens the next phase of the game. And this is where many people start to ask themselves an uncomfortable question. If these signs are so small, so subtle, why do so many people miss them? The answer isn't just in the handlers. It's something much deeper. It's in how we were trained to behave from an early age. Because most of us have learned something that seems like virtue, but that in certain contexts turns into vulnerability. We learn not to appear difficult. We learn not to create discomfort. We learn that being polite means keeping the environment light, even when something inside us is uncomfortable. Think for a moment about how many times you have heard phrases like, "Never mind. Don't make it a problem. He didn't mean it. Relax, it was just a joke." These phrases seem pacifying, and they often really are, but there is a silent side effect that almost no one notices. They train people to doubt their own emotional perception. If something bothers you, perhaps you are exaggerating. If something seems strange, maybe it's just an impression. If someone crosses a small line, perhaps you should be more understanding. Now imagine what happens when someone who knows how to manipulate relationships meets someone who has been trained to think like that. It's almost like finding a door ajar, because the handler doesn't need to drop anything. He just pushes lightly and watches. Observe something curious about human behavior. When a small threshold is crossed, many people don't react immediately. They first carry out an internal assessment. Is there anything worth saying? Is this really important? Am I reading this wrong? This process seems rational, but it creates a very useful space for whoever is testing you. Because while you analyze, he observes. While you ponder, it collects data. As you try to maintain harmony, it measures how far that harmony is more important than your own limit. And this psychological detail is central. Social manipulators rarely seek direct conflict in the beginning. They are looking for something much more valuable. They seek tolerance of social discomfort. People who avoid conflict at any cost. People who feel uncomfortable, but manage it alone. People who absorb small invasions to preserve the climate. Maybe you're listening to this right now and thinking, but reacting all the time isn't healthy either. And you're right. No one wants to live in a constant state of confrontation. But there is a huge difference between two things, between being kind and abandon your own limit to keep the peace. This line is much thinner than it appears, and manipulators are experts at walking exactly on it. They don't start by pushing giant limits. They start in ambiguous zones, situations where you could react, but it might seem exaggerated, times when something was uncomfortable, but socially tolerable. And in these moments, many people's brains do something automatic. He chooses the calmest version of reality. It must be nothing. Maybe I'm being sensitive. I'll let it go. Now imagine that someone repeats small situations like this several times. Nothing big, nothing scandalous, just small kinks in the dynamics of the relationship. And every time you choose to soften, every time you decide not to confront, every time you make it a priority to keep the mood pleasant. What do you think this communicates to someone watching closely? Does not communicate weakness, but it communicates something that might be even more useful to a manipulator. Communicates emotional predictability. It shows that when faced with social discomfort, you tend to absorb it. It shows that you take responsibility for the atmosphere of the interaction. It shows that you try to keep everything working, and that for someone who explores human relationships is extremely valuable data, because people like this are often empathetic, responsible, loyal, dedicated. But there is a hidden risk in this pattern. When maintaining harmony becomes an absolute priority, your limits slowly begin to disappear, not in a dramatic way, not visibly, but silently. And manipulators notice this silence. They notice when someone feels something, but decides not to turn that feeling into action. They notice when someone notices something strange, but they prefer to rationalize it. And when this pattern repeats itself a few times, the testing phase begins to come to an end. Because the initial question has already been answered. Not the question you heard, but the question that was never said. How far will this person go? To avoid seeming difficult? Because when that answer starts to become clear, the manipulator is no longer just observing. He starts planning his next move. So far, it may seem that we are talking about cold, calculating, almost caricatured people, as if social manipulators were rare, easily identifiable figures with malicious intentions written on their faces. But the reality is often much more disconcerting. Many functional manipulators look exactly the opposite of what we imagine. They can be nice, kind regards, charismatic, sometimes even incredibly sensitive. And this is no coincidence. Because to manipulate someone effectively, you first have to appear confident, safe enough for you to let your guard down, secure enough so that your little intrusions go unnoticed. This is why the first silent test is almost never accompanied by hostility. It comes with something much more convincing: normality. Maybe you've already met someone like this, a person who seems extremely interested in you, who asks deep questions right at the beginning. That shows curiosity about your story, your feelings, your experiences. At first glance, this may seem like connection, and sometimes it really is. But in other cases, there is something different going on there, because there is a subtle difference between genuine interest and emotional information gathering. Social manipulators know that people tend to trust those who seem interested in them. So they listen, observe, they ask. And as they do this, something very specific is being mapped out. Your sensitivity points, your fears, your frustrations, your emotional needs. Now pause for a second. This doesn't mean that every curious person is manipulative, but manipulators are almost always very good at appearing curious, because emotional information is power. The more someone knows about your insecurities, your guilt, and your desires, the easier it becomes to influence your reactions in the future. And this is where the first silent test takes on an even deeper meaning. It's not just for measuring your limits. It serves to discover how you deal with small emotional pressures. Imagine someone who alternates between two behaviors during a conversation. At one point, extremely friendly. In the other, slightly provocative. Nothing aggressive, just small fluctuations. A compliment, followed by a critical remark. A validation, followed by a joke that puts you slightly on the defensive. If you pay attention, you'll notice something interesting. These oscillations generate micro-tensions in the interaction, and the manipulator watches how you respond to them. Do you try to regain approval? Do you try to explain yourself? Do you laugh to show that you are unaffected? Or do you just calmly stand your ground? This type of reading reveals something essential. It shows how much your emotional stability depends on external approval. And manipulators pay a lot of attention to this, because people who constantly try to keep the other person comfortable often end up adjusting their own identity to preserve the relationship. Now comes a sentence that may seem harsh, but it is extremely important. Manipulators don't just look for good people. They look for good people who also have difficulty sustaining conflict. This is the most exploitable profile, not because these people are weak, but because they tend to invest a lot in maintaining the bond. They listen, they understand, they try to resolve it, they try to keep everything running. And for someone who manipulates human relationships, this creates a huge advantage. Because while you're trying to understand each other, he already understands you. While you're trying to build connection, he is analyzing his adaptation points. And if, during the first few silent tests, you show that you prefer to adjust your limits to keep the mood light, then something starts to happen inside his mind. A kind of confirmation, nothing explicit. No dramatic decisions, just an internal recognition. The relationship can move forward, but not because there is necessarily genuine interest. Sometimes, what exists is opportunity. And this is one of the most disturbing parts of this process, because from the outside, everything still looks completely normal, maybe even pleasant. Maybe you feel like you've found someone interesting, someone who listens to you, someone who seems to understand you. But behind this calm appearance, something much colder could be happening. A silent analysis, a constant reading, an assessment of how far you give in when the momentum starts to tilt, and when that reading becomes clear enough. The manipulator finally reaches the conclusion he was looking for from the beginning. Not if you're smart, not if you're interesting, but something much more strategic. if you are someone who, when subtly pressed, tends to adapt before protecting itself. And when that answer is confirmed, the first test ends, but that doesn't mean the game is over. In fact, it is exactly at this moment that it really begins. When the first silent test is approved, something changes in the dynamics of the relationship, not in a dramatic way, not with a visible turnaround, but from that moment on, the manipulator is no longer just observing. He starts to adjust the intensity. Think of it as someone testing the depth of the water before getting in. First, just the toe, then one step, then another, always watching the reaction. Because manipulation rarely happens all at once. It happens in micro advances, small shifts that seem insignificant in isolation, but that, added up over time, completely change the position of the relationship. Maybe the person starts asking for small favors, nothing big, something simple, something you can do easily. And when you do, she shows gratitude, maybe even praise your generosity. Everything looks healthy. But at the same time, a new variable begins to appear: expectation. If you've done it once, maybe you can do it again. Then a little more. Then a little further. Now imagine another situation. The person starts sharing something personal with you. Something delicate, maybe a problem, maybe frustration. You listen, you try to help, you become emotionally involved. This creates something powerful between two people: emotional bonding. But manipulators know how to use this bond strategically, because when someone feels like they have received emotional support from you, an implicit feeling of reciprocity often arises. An invisible debt. Nothing declared, but present. And this creates a perfect ground for small future pressures. Now observe a pattern that usually emerges at this stage. The manipulator begins to alternate proximity and tension. At times, he shows affection, attention, connection. At other times, distance appears. Coldness. Unexpected irritation. These changes confuse the human brain, because we tend to seek consistency in relationships. When someone who seemed close becomes distant, many people automatically try to restore closeness. They ask if something happened. They try to understand. They try to correct it. And at that moment, the manipulator observes something crucial. How far are you willing to go to regain balance in the relationship? Now comes an important question. And it can be uncomfortable. And if the problem was never what that person said, but what did she find out about you when you said nothing? That's the true power of the first silent test. It reveals how you react to imbalance, if you take a stand, or if you try to restore harmony quickly. And when someone learns that you tend to restore harmony, it becomes a tool, because you just need to create small ruptures, small tensions, small frustrations. And watch what you do. You explain yourself. You justify yourself. You try to keep everything going. Without realizing it, you begin to carry more and more emotional responsibility for the relationship. Meanwhile, the handler holds something very important: ambiguity. He never makes it clear that he is pushing. It never makes it clear that there is a game going on. Everything remains in the gray area. Maybe he's just going through a difficult time. Maybe it was just a misunderstanding. Maybe you're interpreting too much. And this question is extremely useful, because when you start to doubt your own perception, your limits become more difficult to sustain. Now notice something curious. Many people, when they begin to feel this growing discomfort, try to resolve the situation by talking more, explaining more, trying to be even more understanding. They believe they are saving the relationship, but sometimes they are just revealing more information about themselves. More tolerance, more willingness to adjust, more willingness to absorb tensions. And manipulators are extremely attentive to this type of information, because for those who play this game, the goal has never been immediate control. The objective has always been gradualness. First the test, then the reading, then small movements. And when you realize the dynamics of the relationship have already changed, you still believe you're just trying to keep things going. But for the manipulator, something much clearer has already happened. He already knows where his margins are. He already knows how much discomfort you can handle before reacting. He already knows how much you value keeping the relationship stable. And when someone deeply understands these 3 points, influencing your behavior becomes much easier. No screaming, no imposition, no direct confrontations, just little nudges, small tensions, small movements. Until one day, you look at the relationship and feel something strange, as if he was trying very hard to maintain something that should be natural. And at that moment, many people begin to realize that something is wrong. But when that realization comes, the dynamics are often much more advanced than they seemed at the beginning, because it all started way back when, in that almost invisible moment, in that silent little test that seemed to mean nothing. There is a moment when some people start to realize that something is not right, not because a big conflict happened, but because a feeling arises that is difficult to explain, a feeling that the relationship requires too much effort, that you're always trying to adjust something, always trying to maintain balance, always trying to prevent the mood from going bad. And when someone starts to realize this, something important happens. Conscience comes into play. But here there is a detail that almost no one teaches. Noticing manipulation does not require you to discover the other person's intentions. This is almost impossible. What matters is something else. Observe patterns. Patterns of small invasions. Stress patterns followed by approximation. Patterns of situations where you end up explaining yourself too much. When these patterns begin to appear, the question should not be, is this person manipulative? The more useful question is much simpler. How am I reacting in these situations? Because the game of manipulation depends on something fundamental. It's constant adaptation. Manipulators test, advance, and pressure, but they can only go far when they find someone who absorbs these movements. And this completely changes the way of dealing with this type of dynamic. It's not about becoming suspicious of everyone. It's not about confronting every detail, but to recover something that many people were taught to abandon. The ability to sustain small discomforts without immediately explaining yourself. Imagine those initial situations again. An invasive question, an interruption, an ambiguous joke. When this happens, many people's automatic reaction is to soften. They laugh, they justify it, they try to keep the environment pleasant. But there is a silent alternative that completely changes the reading of the interaction. Do not react aggressively, but also don't adjust right away. Sometimes just a pause changes the dynamic. A brief silence, a curious look, a simple question back. Why did you ask that? Something curious happens in these moments. People who are just being spontaneous usually explain themselves naturally. But people who are testing limits are often momentarily disconcerted, because the test is no longer invisible. You brought awareness to the moment. And manipulators depend precisely on the absence of this awareness. Now listen to something important. Here in this space, many people who follow this type of reflection tend to discover the same thing over time. The true limit does not have to be aggressive. It needs to be clear to yourself. Because when you start supporting your own internal limits, something immediately changes. You stop carrying the emotional responsibility for the interaction alone. You no longer need to rush to restore harmony. You don't need to smooth out every tension. You simply observe. And when someone realizes that small tests don't produce the expected effect, something interesting happens. Many manipulators quickly lose interest, not because they were confronted, but because the terrain is no longer predictable. They realize that the person in front of them does not automatically adapt, that she notices the little twists in the dynamics, that she can sustain silence, discomfort, and limits. And manipulators prefer environments where the path is easier. Now think about this for a moment. How many problematic relationships begin not with major abuses, but with repeated small concessions? Little moments when you felt something strange, but decided to ignore it. Little moments when you wanted to react, but chose to preserve the atmosphere. It is in these micro-instants that the dynamics are built. And when someone starts to realize this, something powerful happens. The person stops trying to control others, and he begins to observe his own position within the interaction. This changes everything, because social manipulators don't fear confrontation as much as they fear something much rarer: quiet lucidity. People who don't need to prove anything. People who don't rush to please. People who don't play invisible games. People who simply notice. And when that realization dawns early enough, many games end before they even begin. But there is still one last detail. A detail that makes this theme much deeper than it seems at first glance. Because handlers are not the only reason these tests work. There is something within human nature itself that makes all of this possible, and understanding this completely changes the way you see your relationships. There is a rare moment when all of this starts to become clear, not in a theoretical way, but visceral. You start to realize that certain interactions always leave the same kind of feeling. A strange tiredness, a constant need to adjust your behavior, an exaggerated attention to the other person's mood, as if the stability of the relationship depended more on you than on her. And when this pattern appears, something inside you awakens, a kind of silent warning. Maybe you've already felt this. That feeling that you're always trying to keep everything balanced, while the other person seems comfortable letting the scales tip. And at that moment, a question arises that changes everything. A simple question, but deeply liberating. Why am I always the one who needs to adjust? When this question appears, the game begins to change, because manipulators depend on one specific thing to keep your dynamics going. Emotional predictability. They need to know that when faced with tension, you will soften. That, in the face of discomfort, you will accommodate. That, faced with silence or distance, you will move first. But when someone starts to notice the pattern, that predictability disappears, and that completely changes the equation. Suddenly, small intrusions no longer go unnoticed. Ambiguous comments are no longer ignored. Emotional fluctuations no longer provoke the same urgency to resolve everything. Not because the person has become cold, but because she began to hold something extremely powerful. Conscience. Awareness that not all tension needs to be immediately resolved. Awareness that limits are not aggression. Awareness that silence can also be an answer. And there is a very specific moment when manipulators notice this change. They test again, a little tease, a little pressure, a small break in expectations, and something different happens. You don't rush to restore harmony. You watch. You sustain the discomfort for a few seconds longer. You respond calmly, or sometimes you don't respond at all. And that little psychological shift is huge, because for the first time the dynamic is no longer one-sided. Now there is something that manipulators rarely appreciate: unpredictability. They no longer know exactly how you will react. And when predictability disappears, manipulative interest often begins to wane. Because efficient manipulation depends on clear reading. It depends on knowing exactly which buttons to press. But when someone starts protecting their own boundaries early, those buttons stop working in the same way. Now pay attention to something important. Understanding these dynamics does not mean living in distrust of everyone. It does not mean turning relationships into battlefields. In fact, it means exactly the opposite. It means learning to notice when a relationship is naturally balanced, and when it requires only one side to make adjustments. Emotionally healthy people don't need to test you all the time. They do not need to create small tensions to measure their reactions. They don't need to explore gray areas to advance. They respect limits because they understand something very simple. Real relationships don't need games. Now think for a moment about the people in your life. How many of them respect their limits naturally? How many of them can hear a no without turning it into tension? How many of them don't require you to constantly manage the climate of the relationship? These are important questions, because the sooner you recognize manipulative patterns, the sooner you break the cycle. And that doesn't require dramatic confrontations. Sometimes it just requires something much simpler: to perceive, breathe, and don't immediately rush to restore harmony when something seems off. Because when you hold this small space of awareness, something changes profoundly. The first silent test loses power. And manipulators tend to realize this very quickly, much faster than we imagine. They notice when someone is no longer willing to adapt automatically. They notice when someone observes more and explains less. They notice when someone maintains their position without needing to create conflict. And at that moment, two things often happen. Or the manipulator loses interest, or he reveals more clearly who he really is. Either way, something becomes evident. You are no longer playing the same game, and that completely changes the fate of the relationship. Because at the end of the day, emotional maturity isn't just about empathy. It's not just about understanding. It's also about realizing when someone is trying to figure out how far you will bend. And choose, consciously, do not bend. Some people spend years trying to understand why certain relationships always seem to follow the same script. They meet someone new. The connection starts well. There is interest. There is closeness. But at some point, that familiar feeling of overexertion arises, as if, little by little, the emotional responsibility for the relationship began to fall more on them. If you've ever experienced something like this, there's a good chance that it all started much earlier than it seemed. Maybe back there, in that first seemingly innocent conversation, in that little comment you decided to ignore, in that question that seemed too soon, but that you answered anyway. These moments seem insignificant, but for people who manipulate relationships, they are extremely revealing, because in these small moments crucial information emerges: how far you protect your own emotional space, or how flexible you make it to keep everything working. And here's a truth that many people discover too late. Manipulators rarely enter relationships trying to destroy someone. They come in trying to test possibilities. They watch, try it, push a little, back off, measure. And if they realize that there is room to move forward, they move forward. Not all at once, but step by step, almost always imperceptibly. This is why the first silent test is so important, because it defines something fundamental. If that relationship will be based on mutual respect or in unilateral adaptation. Now think about something curious. Manipulators don't like people who are impossible to read. They avoid those who hold limits early. They avoid anyone who notices small intrusions. They avoid anyone who doesn't feel the urgency to restore every social tension. Because these people make the game unpredictable. And unpredictability is the opposite of control. Maybe you're realizing something now that you never considered before. Maybe some situations from the past are starting to make more sense. That person who seemed charming at first, but who gradually began to require more adjustments. That friendship that always seemed balanced, until you started saying no. That relationship where you always had to explain too much. If any of this resonates with you, know one thing. You are not alone in this perception. Many people here who follow this type of psychological investigation have already gone through exactly this process of discovery. Because understanding social manipulation isn't just about identifying dangerous people. It's about understanding something deeper about human behavior. It's about realizing that some people don't reach out looking for connection. They approach each other seeking a margin of influence. And to discover that margin, they ask questions, but not always with words. Sometimes the question is disguised as a joke, sometimes out of curiosity, sometimes small invasions that seem irrelevant. But behind these situations there is always the same silent investigation. A question that is rarely said out loud. How far will this person adapt so that I remain comfortable? And perhaps the most powerful way to answer that question, not through confrontations, don't be through accusations, but through something much simpler. Conscience. Awareness of when something seems out of place. Awareness that limits do not need long justifications. Awareness that occasional discomfort is a healthy part of true relationships. When you develop this awareness, something changes profoundly. You don't need to become tough. There is no need to become suspicious. But you start to notice much sooner when someone is measuring your emotional territory. And interestingly, when manipulators realize this, they often look elsewhere to test. Because the first silent test only works when it goes unnoticed. When someone starts to see it, it loses its power. And perhaps this is the most unsettling part of this whole story. How many times throughout your life has someone done this test on you, without you realizing it? How many seemingly normal conversations contained small, invisible measurements? How many relationships started exactly like this? This question can be uncomfortable, but it can also be extremely liberating. Because the more you understand these dynamics, the less space they have to repeat themselves. And this brings us to a final reflection. The biggest mistake when thinking about manipulators is believing that the danger begins when the behavior becomes clearly toxic. In fact, the danger begins much earlier. It starts the moment someone is just watching you, while you believe they are just being polite. It begins in that first, almost invisible moment, in which a small invasion takes place, and no one says anything. And that's exactly where the manipulator discovers something fundamental about you. If you are someone who protects your own boundaries, or someone who bends them to keep the peace. Because for those who manipulate human relationships, that has always been the only question that really matters.